So now we enter to talk about Josh Fox. Josh Fox is the keynote speaker of the 2014 Greening the Statehouse. And it is fitting that this Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, this Oscar-nominated filmmaker, is our keynote speaker, because he will hopefully help to shape the consciousness of fellow Hoosiers about the fact that here and now in 2014, in the most sophisticated country in the world, in the most advanced country in the world, we face significant toxic threats. And so Josh has traveled across the country showcasing his films Gasland and Gasland 2, and talking to people both about the groundwater contamination and air quality contamination risks of fracking and of natural gas drilling, and also talking about the power of the citizen voice. So with no further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Josh Fox. Thank you.
Good morning. Do you feel a little bit like I'm floating through space? You know, good morning, Intergalactic Federation. I'm the lone banjo player in the Death Star. This is amazing, though. So I wanted to start off this morning by, first of all, thank you so much, Jesse, for that terrific introduction. It's great to be back in the United States. I just returned from Australia, which hopefully I'll have time to talk a little bit about what I was doing last week. The other time I felt like I was in Star Wars. It's nice to be in Main Street, USA. And I do feel like it's an appropriate moment to discuss what Jesse has just brought up, which is the complete abdication of government and its civic responsibility with respect to the environment. But before I do that, I want to tell you a story of the last time that I saw Pete Seeger and talked to him. You may have seen the Gasland films, Gasland Part 1, Gasland Part 2. We're going to show the first, like 5 minutes of the first one, just to sort of bring people up to speed who haven't seen them. But what I do, aside from the Gasland movies, which are this weird Cinderella story of a guy who got in the back of, got in his 1992 Toyota Camry and traveled across America to try to figure out what fracking was about for a budget of under $5,000. And that film ended up at Sundance, winning an award, going on HBO, being nominated for an Oscar, and being seen in 32 countries by 50 million people worldwide and growing. So that's a very strange tale. So that's what happened in the big media version, but in the small media version, what I have done, what I've made it my goal and it's really my pleasure to do this, is to go on tour with both of those films, or go on tour in this way to speak and meet people all across the world. I've toured to 300 cities in the last 5 years to meet this movement, to meet the people who are concerned about fracking, but not only about fracking, but about tar sands and about coal, and about the deep water drilling, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico. What we don't call silver bullet technologies, we call them extreme energy. Extreme energy being far more polluting. It's sort of like, extreme sports, where they don't ski down the mountain, they ski straight down the Empire State Building. More dangerous, more polluting. The effects of contamination and pollution and destruction are far more certain. The danger is much greater. The probability of failure is certain. So that's what I refer to those so-called technologies as. But in traveling all around America, what I've noticed is this incredible strength of the grassroots. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about where it comes from and how it happens. But as I was on tour last year, opening Gasland 2 across America, just before it was going on HBO, a group of what we call fractivists, my people in Pennsylvania, had reached out to Pete Seeger, and they said, it's hard to fight fracking in Pennsylvania. It's almost as hard to do that as to be an environmentalist in Indiana. And And they reached out to Pete Seeger. They said, we have a 100-year-old theater, and we need some inspiration. You know, it was a room smaller than this, 200 people maybe. And will you please come and just give us a concert, give us a small concert for the fracking movement? And 94-year-old Pete Seeger, as he always did, you know, said, sure, I'll come by. And he brought a band, and at 94, I watched him give a full hour-long concert. Unbelievable. And, you know, they called me up, and they asked me if I would introduce him. So that's scary. And I said, absolutely. And I had this idea, you know, that I wanted to play, you know, in order to introduce him somehow. That was kind of an audacious plot. And backstage, I went up to him and I wanted to find out, I wanted to make sure that the song that I was going to play was going to be okay with him. You know, I said, I had this particular song in mind. I said, Pete, do you mind if I play this? And he looked right at me and he goes, you know, that was the greatest hit song of 1814. Like he was there, you know. He said, a fella sang that song in a bar one night, and it was such a big hit, he had to sing it twice. I guess in those days there was no jukebox. You had to sing it again if you wanted to hear it again, you know. And then all up and down the North Atlantic coast, clip clop at 4 miles an hour, that song became the most popular song in the United States of America. I said, wow, I didn't know that. And I knew there was a lesson in there, you know. And so, in the course of playing it for his introduction, I figured it out. So I'm going to play it for you now, and you can see if you can catch what this tune is. Here, I'm going to adjust this. Can you hear that okay? Usually I do this sitting down, but I'm going to do my best. Play ball. Star Spangled Banner. Adopted in 1930 as our national anthem. And you know, I learned a lot of lessons from Pete Seeger over the years, most of them from afar. You know, the first concert I ever went to was Pete Seeger. The second concert I ever went to was Pete Seeger. The third concert I ever went to was Pete Seeger. Fourth concert and fifth concert I ever went to was Pete Seeger. The sixth concert I went to was Kiss. The seventh concert I went, you know, was Pete Seeger. I was that kind of kid, or rather, I had those kind of parents. And I learned, you know, that if you wanted to get New York City, for example, involved in a conversation about the environment, Remind them that their water comes from 100 miles upstate and travels down an aqueduct to the city, like he did with the Clearwater, and he sailed it down the Hudson, connecting upstate environmental issues with the city. Or, that music and culture was a great way to start a conversation about politics and organizing. But this lesson I got from right up close. And it was, be careful what you do in a bar. You might start a nation. No, I'm kidding. The lesson was, if a bar song can become the national anthem, then we're really just making up the United States of America as we go along. And anything can happen. Anything can happen. And here was this 94-year-old icon, one of these great authors of America itself, urging us, this 200 people in a tiny theater, to be that next great author, to write that next great song, to write that next great story, to envision that next great chapter of the United States of America, and saying, it's your responsibility to do this. You never know what's going to happen in a room like this that might influence the next 100 years, and it is your responsibility to think about it that way. And that's what I love about the environmental movement in the United States right now. It's based in those kinds of rooms. I watched, the Damascus Citizens for Sustainability, or Frack Action, or New Yorkers Against Fracking. I watched these groups start as 5 people sitting around a picnic table in their backyard, and 6 years later, still no fracking in New York State. 6 years later, a moratorium that has saved the Delaware River Basin. I watched that start as 5 people sitting around going, what are we going to do to defeat the largest corporations in the history of Earth that have more money than any corporations in the history of money, as my friend Bill McKibben likes to say. So I find that amazingly inspiring, and I know that what you are all up to and what you're about is to try and create that next chapter for Indiana and for yourselves here. But I want to also remind you this morning how that has national and international implications and why it's so important that you keep doing it. So here's what I want to do was just scale back 6 years in time to 2008, and when I started the Gasland film, which was begun really as 5-minute YouTube videos to educate my neighbors. We showed it on the side of the Delaware River on the back of a truck. We showed 20 minutes, we showed 5 minutes, we showed whatever we had of it for years up until when it premiered. So I want to show you the first 5 minutes here to situate me a little bit in this technology, or so-called technology. It's not really technology, it's more like brute force with a lot of carcinogens involved. And to play that so that you get a little bit of a sense before I move on. Okay, so ready to roll?
Hi, my name is Josh Fox. Maybe I'll start at the beginning. This is Dick Cheney. No. Maybe I'll start at a different beginning. This is my house. It's in the middle of the woods, tucked away on a dirt road in a place called Milanville, Pennsylvania. The house was built in 1972 when I was born. My parents and their hippie friends built it, and my family and my sisters and I grew pretty much the same way I did, little by little. There's a stream that runs down the property, connects to the Delaware River. I've been learning more and more about how water is all connected. In 1972, the year I was born, Pete Seeger and a bunch of banjo-playing freaks in the Upper Hudson Valley reminded New York City that if they polluted the Upper Hudson, especially the watershed areas, that New York City's drinking water would be ruined.
This land is made for you and me.
In 1972, Richard Nixon signed the Clean Water Act into law. It was an era of environmental progress. The Cold War was on, but there was the concept of leisure time and leisure suits. Computers and technology were supposed to bring about the 4-day work week. and everyone was going to have plenty of time romping around the fields and swimming in the rivers. In New York City, they were building this, but 100 miles upriver in Milanville, Pennsylvania, on the banks of the Delaware, we were building this. My first word was hammer. But it's 2009. One day I got a letter in the mail. It was from a natural gas company. The letter told me that my land was on top of a formation called the Marcellus Shale, which stretched across Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and West Virginia, and that the Marcellus Shale was the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. I could lease my land to this company, and I would receive a signing bonus of $4,750 an acre. Having 19.5 acres, that was nearly $100,000, right there in my hand. Could it be that easy? You've probably seen ads on television hailing natural gas as the clean-burning transition fuel.
American shale basins contain an ocean of natural gas.
What I want is to use our resources in America. It's cheaper and it's ours. It's ours.
What would it mean if the United States and the rest of the world adopted natural gas as the fuel of the future?
We've cracked the code for natural gas supply.
And what I didn't know was that the 2005 energy bill pushed through Congress by Dick Cheney exempts the oil and natural gas industries from the Safe Drinking Water Act. They were also exempt from the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Superfund Law, and about a dozen other environmental and democratic regulations. And when the 2005 energy bill cleared away all the restrictions, companies like Encana, Williams, Cabot Oil and Gas, and Chesapeake began to use the new Halliburton technology, and they began the largest and most extensive domestic gas drilling campaign in history, now occupying 34 states. The method of gas drilling they use is called hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. It blasts a mix of water and chemicals 8,000 feet into the ground. The fracking itself is like a mini earthquake. The intense pressure breaks apart the rock and frees up the gas. In order to frack, you need some fracking fluid, a mix of over 596 chemicals, from the unpronounceable to the unknown to the too well known. The brew is full of corrosion inhibitors, gelants, drilling additives, biocides, shale control inhibitors, liquid breaker aids, viscosifiers, liquid gel concentrates. On the side of that frac fluid truck, it should say, just add water. Each time they drill a well, they need between 1 and 7 million gallons of water. Each time they go back and frac an existing well, they need an additional 1 to 7 million gallons of water. They can frac a well up to 18 times in its life. They started out west, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and in the south, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama. 450,000 wells, times 18, times 1 to 7 million gallons, is something like 40 trillion gallons of water, all of it infused with the 596 chemicals in the fracking fluid. And now they're coming east. They're proposing 50,000 gas wells along a 75-mile stretch of the Delaware River, and hundreds of thousands more across New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. From 1972 until now, my whole life, all this has been protected.
So when this happened, 2008, when we started to get these letters in the mail about leasing our land for fracking, my father looked at this and said, "What is this? Take a look at this. Figure this out. This looks like a scam." He didn't know how right he was. But it was when I started to do the research, before I had gone out into America to make this film and research it, that I was utterly terrified. And it was, there you see the map of oil and gas drilling territory. That doesn't include coal. So if you look at the amount of America that's under siege right now, it's a huge, huge area. The oil and gas industry has currently leased more land in the United States than the entire landmass of California and Florida combined. So, as I was saying, it was an incredibly terrifying and incredibly lonely event. I was unable to sleep for weeks and weeks. until I could try to figure out how to actively participate in this process. And that's what got me out on the road to start interviewing people, never having made a documentary before. And now, just a few weeks ago, 400,000 people marching against climate change in New York City, and fracking signs all throughout that entire march. 204,000 public comments on the environmental impact study in New York State on fracking. Not so lonely anymore. How does that happen? How does change happen? How does the grassroots get born? A thing that I might add is not blue, is not red, is not purple, it's not even really green. It's just itself. When I went out on tour to make these films, I never asked people what their politics were. You know? If I'm in New York, or if I'm in Texas, or I'm in Pennsylvania, or I'm in Indiana, or I'm in Wyoming, from the reddest of the red states to the bluest of the blue states, this map cuts like an invading army in your backyard. It doesn't matter if you are campaigning from the standpoint of a progressive, green environmentalist, or from a Tea Party conservative who's concerned with land rights and private property rights. As Calvin Tillman, the mayor of Dish, Texas, says in Gasland Part 2, private property rights are a principle, main principle of conservatism, and you have no private property rights when the fracking industry comes to town. Not in Texas, at least, that's what he says. So there is something that binds these people from very disparate ideologies together, and I never asked who they voted for president, or what side they were on in the other side political debate. And I keep a card in my wallet of a friend of mine named Craig Stevens out in central Pennsylvania, you know, and it's called Marcellus Patriots for Land Rights, and it has the "Don't Tread on Me" snake with the drill rigs right through the middle of it. It's amazing. He's marching in New York City on climate change now. Things do change. There is green tea. So, how does this happen? I'm going to tell you about the story of, am I doing that? Susan Frey in Guy, Arkansas. She's a dog breeder. She had about 100 of these little black snowflake dogs out behind her house in a big kennel, running back and forth, dipping and yapping. She was obsessed with the earthquakes that were being caused by fracking and injection wells in her area. And she had gotten a plumb bob. Maybe there's a way to fix this. Huh? Is there another mic? Maybe I have one of the mics for the questions? Or is that something else that's doing that? Okay, if anyone has one of the mics from the questions, can you run them up here so I can use that instead? She had a plumb bob and she put it on the bottom of her coffee table, and every time it moved back and forth, she would look on the USGS earthquake site and say, see, there was another earthquake. They had 1,000 earthquakes in a 6-month period. And most of them were small, microquakes, you know? But they're working on it. But then a 4.0 put cracks in the walls of the local high school, popularizing iPhone's earthquake app with teenagers, and throwing, here we go. Okay, we're swapping this. And throwing the earthquake ladies, that's better. Awesome, thank you. And throwing the earthquake lady's husband out of his lazy boy chair. And I imagine that when he hit the ground, something happened. Or Amy Ellsworth from Gasland 1 in Colorado, whose water was so flammable that you could light it on fire at the tap. And she was so terrified, the word she used was terror, that she was showering in the dark afraid that a spark from her light bulb would blow her bathroom up. And I imagine that she was standing there naked in the dark, fumbling for a towel, and something happened. Or the G family in Pennsylvania. 5 generations on the same land in Tioga County. Shell built a 6-well horizontal fracking pad about 150 feet from their bedroom window. And their pond was dying from toxic runoff. They had toxic material coming down the hill into their land from their neighbor's property, who had leased. They could light their water on fire. And they had to get out of that situation, sell their land to the Shell, sign a non-disclosure agreement which stated they could never talk about what happened to them. So they traded their First Amendment rights, their ability to tell their own story, for the ability to get out of Gasland. And I imagine that when they closed the door behind them the last time and realized they didn't need to lock it, something happened. Or Kendra Arneson and the other fishermen and women down in the Gulf describing the contamination of the Gulf of Mexico as their worst nightmare comes true, saying, we're not seeing, even just a few months ago when I talked to her, we're not seeing the fish come back. We're seeing our species that we harvest devastated. We collect samples, send them to LSU. They never send them back. The FDA tells us it's up to us to monitor the pollution in the fish. We have to comply with the law ourselves, put ourselves out of business. How many fishermen do you think are doing that? And then in a theater in Louisiana, one of these guys, this amazing fisherman, said, I'm gonna have to go back to school at age 57 to learn something new because 94% of my oyster catch is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And I imagine that as that fisherman sat down at his desk, with the Gulf water still rocking him back and forth for his first class, I imagine something happened to him. Or Bree Jackson, resident of the Rockaways in New York City, who saw almost 2 years ago exactly the winds blowing so hard and the waves growing so high that her peninsula was completely submerged, the ocean on one side and the bay on the other side, meeting each other like lovers that had been separated for centuries and now going on a tear. And she learned from my friend Bill McKibben personally to call that Hurricane Exxon rather than Hurricane Sandy, so that we name these storms after the people who are causing them. We know that climate change creates the conditions for extreme weather. The atmosphere is 5% wetter. This creates huge superstorms. And you're watching this happen, whether it's the drenching of the East or the parching of the Midwest. So I imagine as she was running up and down the stairs delivering water to senior citizens trapped on the 9th floor of their projects to flush their toilets because all services had evaporated for months. I imagine something happened to her. Or a guy I met last week named Mika from the Pacific Island nation of Tokelau, which is 3 meters above sea level, whose island may disappear within this decade, who lost 14 family members as a high tide came in and just swept them out to sea, who told me that he gets his strength from the ocean because it's the most powerful and terrifying thing that there is. And he, in Australia last week, along with about 150 other people, got in a canoe, a hand-carved traditional canoe, and stood and paddled out in a channel to stand in front of Australian coal ships that were leaving the largest coal port in the world to blockade and stopped with a canoe 578,000 tons of coal. Or Lois Frank, the former police commissioner of the Blood Tribe in Canada, who was arrested on her own ancestral lands trying to block fracking trucks from coming in and fracking on the Blood Reservation, the largest reserve in Canada. These people who put themselves in between the opposition and the truth, I imagine something happens to them. And when people learn their stories and see what they're doing and understand and appreciate the bravery that that takes, I think that's how this grassroots thing starts. When you look at it from your own local perspective, and this was one of the reasons why I wanted to go to so many places, went to about 20 states to film the first movie, to be connective tissue, to say, this is one big thing, whether you're fighting tar sands or concerned with climate change, or dealing with fracking in Pennsylvania, or dealing with the Gulf of Mexico, or the Keystone XL pipeline runs down the center of the country like a scar that will never heal. These are not isolated struggles. This is this moment, this is 2014, and everyone is on the front line. Because I know that even though we saved the Delaware River Basin, I have the incredible privilege of living in this pristine watershed that provides clean water to 16 million people in New York City and Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey. Even though that place is as pure as it gets, the Pennsylvania Fishing Commission tells me that I can't eat more than one smallmouth bass per month out of the Delaware River. Why? Because of coal-fired power plants raining down acid rain, mercury pollution from the Midwest, from Indiana, from Ohio, from Michigan. It's all connected. So, what I'm saying is that as you fight your coal ash power plants, and as you fight all of the battles that Jesse brought up, you're connected with Mika, who's in his canoe. I mean, who I was right beside filming, you know, the other time I felt like I was in Star Wars, these little canoes up against these coal ships that were like the Death Star. They really actually look like those planes and the big ones and, you know, Star Wars. It was a remarkable occasion. You're right there. You're standing right there, if you want to be. And that's why it's so important to do the things like show up for those marches, the climate marches, or attack these things one by one. Because I want to tell you a cautionary tale to end about 2 states. My 2 states. Because I live on the border. I live about a mile from New York State inside Pennsylvania. Okay? New York State decided that something was new about hydraulic fracturing that they didn't understand, they didn't know about. Nobody understood what it was. So what they decided to do, and this was very wise, was start an environmental review, an environmental impact study called the SGICE, Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. That provided a chance for citizens to comment and make input. So there were meetings like this in high schools all across the state where citizens lined up and said, I heard this about fracking and I heard that about fracking. There was a scoping process where New York State decided, all right, well, we're gonna have to listen to our citizens to provide a framework, a regulatory framework for this hydraulic fracturing. Pennsylvania did the opposite. Pennsylvania just said, just come on in, whatever. So throughout the 5-year environmental review, which kept getting extended, how did it get extended? Well, the first comment period, New Yorkers submitted 13,000 public comments. That broke the record for comments on an environmental impact study of all time, which had been 1,000 on a different issue. Now, the Department of Environmental Protection had to respond to all those comments individually before they went ahead with their regulatory framework. and go to a second review period. That second review period, grassroots people in New York State assembled 78,000 public comments on their environmental impact study. So the Department of Environmental Conservation had to go ahead and respond to all those. This was a conversation between government and citizenship. That's what democracy is, right? It's not just voting in a booth every once in a while. This is a real conversation that is democracy. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, the gas industry ravages. We find radioactive flowback, toxic waste from the fracking process in Pittsburgh's public drinking water supply because no one is monitoring, no one is regulating the flow of toxic material into the Monongahela River, which supplies Pittsburgh with drinking water. We find radioactive material in Pennsylvania streams. We have actually thousands of potential contamination cases in Pennsylvania due to fracking and drilling, and now we have hundreds of them that have been confirmed by the own DEP that's rubber stamping this process. In PA, we call the DEP Department of Everything Permitted. And New York then organizes, has a framework, and the next review period, 204,000 New Yorkers comment on environmental impact study, smashing the previous record of 1,000 by quite a few people. And what most of those comments said was, we want to ban. We've seen enough. We've learned enough over the last 4 or 5 years. We just want to ban. And we won't stop until we get a ban. And we're going to follow Governor Cuomo around. He can't have a birthday party without 50 fractivists showing up with signs. I mean, the Plaza Hotel in New York City for Cuomo's birthday. He can't go to the state fair without people bird dogging him right there. And it's amazing to watch. And he has had to pay attention. And that's how you beat, so far anyway, the largest industries who are seeking to keep us addicted to their product. Now, when it comes to what you're faced with here, and this moratorium on regulations, wow. That's like saying, you know, we're going to tie our hands, sit in a chair, and light our house on fire, so that we can't do anything to stop the ravaging of our environment all around us. It's not only an abdication of responsibility. It's actually I don't use the word tyranny lightly, but it's clear that masquerading as some kind of libertarian philosophy is the total handover of all of your public wealth to the corporate machine that would grind this state into dust for profit if it had the chance to do it, every last bit of it. Whether you're, you know, and that is a great lie that should be exposed and talked about. And the only way you're going to do it is neighbor talking to neighbor, person talking to person. That's how you change the world. And these groups of 5 people sitting around a picnic table, you say, how do we fix this problem? Because when you look at the democratic process that happened in New York State, that was a regulatory review on a new thing. And it allowed the citizens a chance to understand what might change their state forever and say, we don't want this. Because the bottom line is, right now, we don't need gas, and we don't need coal, and we don't need oil going into the future. We have renewable energy technology that can run the world. That's the good news. The good news is that there's actually a solution to this problem. It's called wind and sun. And they rain down on the planet free every day. And, you know, I started with Mark Ruffalo and a guy named Mark Jacobson from Stanford University and a bunch of bankers from California, an organization called the Solutions Project. And we mapped out what it would take for every single state to go 100% renewable. And I started a group called Solutions Grassroots, which can supply your 5-person meeting or your 200-person meeting with the tools to go renewable right now in every state. You can buy renewable energy as your electricity, even in Indiana. So go to Solutions Grassroots, Keynote.com and check that out. It's an organizing strategy, but it's also commerce working. You know, renewable energy is business. It is jobs. Those companies have agreed to sponsor and support grassroots organizations at the local level. So these things are doable, and they're amazing to participate in. I can't tell you how amazing it was to hear 400,000 people do a moment of silence in the streets of New York City. I can't tell you how amazing it was to be in a hand-carved canoe facing an enormous coal ship, and that's something you'll see in my next film, which is about the climate, which is sort of completing this crazy journey from the gas industry knocking at my door in 2008 till now. That's what I think we're charged with. That's the mission. And what's amazing and wonderful about it is that it is so much fun, and it is a source of so much positive energy and joy to just sit here and meet the people who are sitting next to you, to meet, like I did last night, the Hoosier Environmental Council. These are just people in our community, people in our world who decided that they want to care about this. And I applaud you for it, and thank you for being here this morning. And thank you for listening to me. And we'll definitely take some questions. Thank you.